The first snow of the year lay thin and deceptive across Lockdub, frosting the heather and softening the hard edges of the village as if to disguise what had happened overnight. Hogmanay had ended only hours before, and the echoes of laughter, fiddles, and drunken promises still seemed to hang in the cold air. It was meant to be a morning of headaches and regret, not sirens. The body was discovered just after dawn, when Mrs. Munro went to open the kirk for New Year prayers. Alasdair Campbell lay on the stone floor of the vestry, neatly arranged as if someone had taken care with him. He was fully dressed, his coat buttoned, his boots clean despite the snow outside. His face was calm, almost peaceful, except for the thin, dark line at his throat. He had been strangled quietly, efficiently. What unsettled everyone was not only the murder, but where it had taken place. The vestry door had been locked from the inside. The windows were small, barred, and untouched. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood spatter, just a dead man in a locked room. By mid-morning, the village was buzzing with speculation. Alasdair Campbell was not the sort of man one expected to find murdered. He was a retired schoolteacher, punctual, polite, and deeply invested in local traditions. Every Hogmanay, without fail, he led the village in the ancient ritual of making New Year oaths solemn, promises spoken aloud in the kirk, meant to bind the speaker to better behaviour in the year ahead. He believed in them fiercely. Some said obsessively. The police from Inverness arrived first, bringing with them the usual air of impatience. They examined the luck, the windows, the body. They photographed, measured, muttered. The verdict was immediate and unsatisfying. Someone must have locked the door after killing him and escaped before anyone noticed. When asked how exactly that was possible, the officers offered shrugs instead of answers. Then there was the clue. Tucked carefully into Alasdair's breast pocket was a small scrap of paper, folded once. On it were 3 words, written in a careful hand: I swear never. No name, no date, no explanation. Some thought it a dying message, others a cruel joke. A few whispered that it was one of Alasdair's oaths, written down for once instead of spoken. The officers dismissed it as meaningless people wrote all sorts of things on scraps of paper. It didn't help identify a suspect, and it didn't explain the locked room. By the time Hamish Macbeth arrived, the kirk was surrounded by villagers pretending not to stare. He parked his police car badly as usual and stepped out into the cold, his expression already irritated by the noise, the speculation, and the snow soaking into his shoes. Hogmanay murders were the worst sort. Everyone had been drinking, everyone had been together, and everyone had something to hide. Inside, the vestry felt colder than the rest of the church. Hamish took his time, ignoring the Inverness officer's impatience. He looked at the door first, then the lock, then the key, which still sat snugly in it. He knelt by the body, noting details. No one else seemed interested in the absence of defensive wounds, the faint bruising on the wrists, the careful way the coat had been straightened. Alasdair hadn't been attacked. He'd been restrained. Hamish's eyes moved to the scrap of paper, now sealed in an evidence bag. I swear never, he frowned. Alasdair Campbell never wrote half an oath, never believed in unfinished promises. Hamish glanced around the room again, slower this time. A chair slightly out of place. A faint scuff on the stone floor near the wall. The smell not of alcohol, as expected after Hogmanay, but of soap. Someone had washed their hands. Outside, the village bells began to ring for the New Year service, their sound drifting in through the stone walls. Hamish straightened, his face grim. This was no random killing, no drunken accident. It was planned, personal, and rooted deep in the traditions Lockdub pretended to take lightly, and whatever Alasdair Campbell had sworn never to do. Someone had made sure he would never finish the promise. Hamish lingered after the others began drifting toward routine, the Inverness men already discussing paperwork and transport as if the Rue had yielded all it ever would. He stayed behind, letting the silence settle again, listening to the kirk as it returned to being a kirk rather than a crime scene. The bells faded, footsteps echoed, then stopped. Someone coughed. Hamish waited until the vestry felt empty of attention, if not of people. He moved back to the door and examined the lock a second time. It was old, stubborn, the sort that caught unless turned just so. He tried it gently, then harder. It stuck, then gave with a click. When he locked it again, he noticed the faintest scratch around the keyhole, as if the key had been forced or turned in haste by a hand not used to its quirks. Someone unfamiliar with the door, someone who hadn't grown up opening it every Sunday like Alasdair had. Hamish crouched again, this time near the wall. The scuff he'd noticed earlier wasn't random. It ran in a short arc, toe-shaped, ending abruptly near the chair. He nudged the chair with his foot and saw that one leg was damp, the wood darker than the rest. Soap and water again. Careful cleaning, but not careful enough. Hamish, said Inspector Blair from behind him, voice sharp with impatience. You find something we haven't. Hamish stood slowly. Nothing you'd like, he said mildly. But I'll take a look at. Who saw Mr. Campbell last? Blair snorted. Everyone saw him last night. Hogmanay, remember? Aye, Hamish remembered. That was precisely the problem. The first was Mrs. Munro, trembling now that the excitement had worn off. She insisted she'd left the kirk before midnight, before the oaths were spoken. Hamish watched her hands as she spoke, the way she twisted her scarf tighter with every sentence. She swore she'd seen Alasdair alive then, standing proud at the front, waiting to begin. When Hamish asked why she'd left early, she hesitated a fraction too long before blaming. A headache. Next came Ewan Mackenzie, still smelling of whisky, eyes bloodshot. He laughed too easily, made a show of grief. Alasdair was a good man, he said. A bit strict, mind. Always reminding folk of what they promised. Did he remind you? Hamish asked quietly. Ewan's smile slipped, just for a moment. He reminded everyone. Hamish nodded, filed it away. As the morning crept on, a pattern began to emerge, thin as frost but unmistakable. Several villagers recalled Alasdair pulling people aside after the oaths, speaking low, serious. One mentioned a raised voice. Another recalled seeing someone follow him toward the vestry, though they couldn't or wouldn't say who. Each account felt incomplete, smoothed over, as if the speakers feared the shape their words might take if left rough. It was the reaction of the minister that caught Hamish most. Reverend Todd stood near the door, pale, avoiding the vestry altogether. When Hamish approached, the man stiffened. You locked up last night? Hamish asked. The minister nodded too quickly. Aye, as always. Did you see Mr. Campbell after the service? A pause. A swallow. Eafly. Hamish glanced at the minister's hands. Clean, almost raw, overwashed. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, revealing muddy tracks where villagers had come and gone. Hamish followed one set that led around the side of the kirk toward the vestry window. The bars were intact, the glass unbroken, but beneath it, half hidden in slush, lay a small dark button. He picked it up carefully. It wasn't from Alasdair's coat. Too small, too plain. Inside again. Hamish stood alone for a moment, letting the pieces drift without forcing them together. A locked room. A man who believed in promises. A scrap of paper with a broken oath. Clean hands. A button. And a village full of people who had sworn loudly and publicly. To be better then spent the rest of the night breaking those vows in small, familiar ways. Someone had been afraid of Alasdair Campbell's memory, not just his life. Afraid enough to tidy the scene. Afraid enough to lock the door behind them. Hamish looked once more at the vestry, at the chair, the wall, the quiet order imposed on violence. Deception was there now, thin but visible, like cracks beneath ice. He didn't yet know whose weight would break it, but it would. Hamish let the afternoon stretch on before he began again. People talked more freely once the initial shock dulled, and the kirk returned to its familiar shape. By then, the Inverness officers were growing restless, eager to wrap things up with something tidy enough to file away. Hamish, on the other hand, preferred things untidy. Lies never lay flat for long. He started with Ewan Mackenzie catching him outside the shop, where he'd gone for more drink, despite the hour. Ewan was all openness now, clapping Hamish on the arm as if they were old friends. He repeated his story with extra detail this time, insisting he'd left the kirk before the oaths, insisting he'd spent the rest of the night drinking with others who could swear to it. Funny thing, Hamish said mildly, is Mrs. Fraser says you were still there when Alasdair began speaking. Ewan blinked, just once. She must be mistaken. Must she? Ewan laughed again, louder than necessary. Everyone was half cut. Perhaps, but Hamish noticed Ewan's hand drift to his coat, fingers brushing the place where a button would have been. He didn't comment. Not yet. Next came Mrs. Munro, who had remembered more since the morning. She now claimed she'd heard raised voices near the vestry after midnight, though earlier she'd sworn she'd left before then. When Hamish gently reminded her of this, her face tightened. I didn't want to cause trouble, she said. It's the new year. People say things they don't mean. And sometimes, Hamish said, they mean them very much. She looked away, her silence louder than her words. The minister was harder. Reverend Todd invited Hamish into the manse, offered tea. He didn't drink himself. He spoke carefully, as if every sentence were a sermon. He admitted Alasdair had been concerned about certain villagers failing to keep their oaths in previous years. He admitted there'd been disagreements. He denied any anger. Alasdair believed shame could save a soul, the minister said softly. "I did not." "Did you argue with him last night?" Hamish asked. The minister's mouth thinned. "We disagreed." That was not an answer. Hamish let the silence stretch until the man filled it himself, explaining that Alasdair had wanted to confront someone publicly, name them before the congregation. The minister had urged restraint. No good came of humiliation, especially on the first night of the year. And did he listen? Hamish asked. Reverend Todd folded his hands together. They were red, chapped. He went to pray. A lie, Hamish thought, or at least not the whole truth. By evening, Hamish had spoken to nearly everyone who'd been in the kirk that night. Each account overlapped just enough to seem convincing, yet none aligned cleanly. People remembered Alasdair moving from pew to pew, his voice low but urgent. They remembered someone following him toward the vestry. They remembered locking doors, checking watches, making promises they'd already forgotten what none of them admitted was fear. Hamish returned to the vestry alone, the day's voices echoing in his head. The chair again, the scuff, the careful order. He imagined Alasdair standing there, blocking the door, insisting someone face what they'd sworn. He imagined hands raised not in violence at first, but in defence. A struggle with tea shouting. A man stronger than he looked, desperate not to be exposed. The scrap of paper came back to him. "I swear never." Incomplete by design. A broken oath, or one interrupted. Someone had been given a choice that night. Keep a promise or silence the man who remembered it. As Hamish stepped outside, he saw Ewan Mackenzie across the road, talking too intently with another villager. When Ewan noticed Hamish, he turned away abruptly, pulling his coat tighter. A small thing. But small things were beginning to stack up, each one tilting the picture slightly off balance. The truth was there, hidden beneath polite lies and communal guilt. Hamish could feel it pressing closer, the way a storm does before it breaks. Hamish returned to the small, cluttered office behind the police station, spreading his notes across the wooden desk. The village of Lochtub was quiet now, the snow softening even the sharpest edges of gossip. But inside his mind, the noise of contradictions and half-truths was deafening. Every person he had questioned carried a fragment of the puzzle, yet no single fragment fit neatly. Instead, they overlapped in ways that made the pattern harder to discern, twisting one story into another until clarity felt almost impossible. He started with Ewan Mackenzie. Jealousy hung faintly in the air around the man. Alasdair's persistence with the oaths had embarrassed Ewan before, at the last village council meeting, when the teacher publicly criticised his failure to keep promises. Ewan's laughter that day had been forced, his pride bruised. That, combined with his evident nervousness now, made him an obvious candidate for a rash act of anger, but Hamish wasn't convinced it was enough to commit murder. Still, he filed it under possible motive. Mrs. Munro was more subtle. Fear, tinged with a desire to protect herself and her late husband's memory, ran in every story she told. If Alasdair had glimpsed something she wished hidden, someone in the vestry might have felt threatened. But fear alone rarely drove someone to violence, and Hamish considered her hesitation in repeating her account. What was she holding back? What secret had she shielded from even her own recollection of that night? Then there was Reverend Todd. His temper had always been tempered by faith, yet Hamish sensed a quiet anger beneath the minister's measured tones. Alasdair had openly challenged him, insisting the minister enforce moral discipline that Todd considered beyond his remit. Pride, the need to control perception, and the pressure of standing before a congregation that revered Alasdair, all of it created tension. Todd had a motive that was intellectual, almost surgical, the sort of calculated motive that could explain a murder carried out with meticulous care. Hamish leaned back, rubbing his temples. Greed, jealousy, fear, pride, it all swirled together, yet no single thread explained the locked door, the clean hands, the scrap of paper. And then there was the matter of that small button, found outside the vestry window. It suggested a presence beyond those accounted for. Someone perhaps peripheral, someone the villagers overlooked because they weren't part of the traditional community. A hand too careful to leave evidence, yet careless enough to lose a button, he returned to the timeline. Hogmanay had ended late. Alasdair had led the oaths, gathering everyone in the kirk. Some had left early, some had lingered, but most had followed their old routines. In the middle of the night, someone had separated him from the others, moved him into the vestry, restrained him, and silenced him. That movement alone required planning, someone confident and precise. It wasn't a crime of passion, not entirely, it was deliberate. Hamish began mapping connections in his mind. Ewan, present near the vestry and visibly shaken. Mrs. Munro, hesitant and guarded. Reverend Todd, clean-handed and evasive. And the peripheral presence suggested by the button. Each had something to protect, some reason to fear Alasdair's judgment. yet each also had an alibi that superficially checked out. The web was becoming a maze, and every step deeper into it only revealed more twists. Then he considered the scrap of paper again. "I swear never." Hamish repeated it aloud, letting it roll over his thoughts. Someone had interrupted Alasdair, someone who had known him well enough to predict his reactions, enough to manipulate him into silence. The paper wasn't just a clue, it was a sage, a symbol of broken trust and incomplete promises. Whoever left it had knowledge and intent both, he realized, slowly. That motive in Lochta wasn't simple. It was communal, layered like the village itself. Greed might be personal, but fear was collective. Jealousy mingled with loyalty, pride with guilt. To unravel this, Hamish would need to watch carefully, notice tiny inconsistencies, observe interactions no one thought worth remarking. One glance, one gesture, could unravel the whole maze, and there, at the centre, lay the killer. Not a stranger, not an outsider, but someone who had lived among them, who understood the delicate balance of promises and pride, and who knew exactly what it would take to ensure Alasdair Campbell could never enforce another oath. Hamish closed his notebook, feeling the maze tighten. Now, he just had to find the path through it without getting lost himself. Hamish woke before dawn the next morning, unsettled by a feeling he couldn't shake. Overnight, the village had been humming with rumours of progress. The Inverness officers had found what they called a breakthrough, a set of footprints in the snow near the kirk's side door. They matched Ewan Mackenzie's boots, and the police were eager to pin the crime on him. By mid-morning, they had whisked him to the station for questioning, convinced their fingerprints on paper would be enough to close the case. The village already buzzed with the news Lochta could finally breathe, or so everyone Halt. Hamish, however, remained unconvinced. He had followed Ewan's story, observed his nervous glances, and studied the hesitant explanations from the night before. The footprints alone felt too convenient, too easy. The snow had been soft and partially melted. Anyone could have retraced Ewan's steps and left a mark. Hamish ran his finger along the edge of his notebook, reviewing every small discrepancy he had noted. The button near the window, the scuff by the chair, the faint soap smell that didn't match Ewan's actions. None of it fit neatly into the story of a drunken, jealous man acting alone. When he arrived at the police station, Ewan was seated quietly, hands folded in his lap, still trying to appear calm despite the officer's insistence that he confess. They grilled him about the footprints, the vestry, the timing of the murder, and each question seemed to press him into a corner. Yet Hamish watched him carefully. The man's reactions were not consistent with guilt. There were pauses, hesitations, yes, but they were defensive, not culpable. Hamish saw a flicker in Ewan's eyes the officers didn't notice, a mix of frustration and fear, not the cold calculation of a murderer. Later, Hamish revisited the vestry alone. He moved slowly, touching the back of the chair, scanning the floor, and turning the locked door over in his mind. He replayed the timeline, imagining each villager's movements, the words exchanged, the interruptions, the secret glances. Then he noticed something odd, a faint impression in the dust on a high shelf near the window, something small, something that hadn't fallen to the floor or been cleaned. A second button, slightly larger, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. It wasn't from Alasdair. It wasn't from Ewan. It belonged to someone else entirely. Hamish felt a tightening in his chest. The authorities were ready to declare victory, to celebrate the capture of the supposed killer, but the evidence whispered otherwise. The pieces didn't add up. The killer had left intentional misdirection, subtle enough to fool the casual observer, the eager policeman. He realized the murderer was still out there, still moving in plain sight, waiting for a moment when suspicion would fade. Hamish considered the scrap of paper again. "I swear never." It was more than a clue. It was a warning, an echo of unfinished business. The true criminal had understood Alasdair's habits, the village's secrets, and the weight of a broken oath. By late autumn, Hamish returned to Ewan, sitting across from him quietly, letting the officers talk themselves into a false sense of closure. "You're telling the truth," Hamish said softly. "I can feel it in your words." Ewan looked up, surprised, relief, and anxiety mingling in his eyes. "Then why are they so sure it's me?" Hamish shrugged. "Because it's easy. Because people want something tidy to hold on to. But tidy isn't always right. Watch closely, Ewan. Don't do anything different tonight." The day ended with the officers triumphantly filing reports, the village ready to move on, and Ewan left alone to wait. Hamish walked the snow-covered streets, every step echoing in the quiet. The true murderer had not yet shown themselves, but Hamish knew they were close. The scent of fear, of careful planning, lingered in the cold air. And somewhere in the shadows, someone was smiling at the chaos they had created. waiting for the right moment to strike again. Hamish pressed his hands into his coat pockets, eyes narrowing. This was no simple crime of passion. The real game had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than anyone realized. The false victory felt heavy, suffocating, and he knew that unless he stayed vigilant, the web of deception would tighten, leaving him and Locked trapped in its threads. Hamish stayed awake long into the night, the wind rattling the eaves of his small cottage, the snow drifting silently over Lough. He reviewed every detail again, the footprints, the buttons, the incomplete oath, the clean hands, the hesitations and half-truths. Something nagged at him, a memory of a file long tucked away in the back of the police archives, a minor case from years ago, dismissed quietly, forgotten by everyone but him. It had involved Alasdair Campbell, though barely, a disagreement over village records, a petty accusation of mismanagement, and a young man named Malcolm Fraser, Mrs. Munro's late husband, who had walked away humiliated but without arges. The details had seemed irrelevant at the time, a small dispute blown out of proportion in the tight-knit village. Yet now, in the frozen light of January, Hamish wondered if it had been a seed. By morning he visited Mrs. Munro again gently, in her home. She was stiff with old grief and new fear. Hamish mentioned Malcolm Fraser not to accuse but to observe. Her face tightened. She spoke of pride, of grudges buried beneath years of tradition, of Alasdair's insistence that the village maintain its oaths at all costs. Hamish noted every flicker of expression, every hesitation, the way her fingers curled around the teacup. Fear was still there, mingled with something sharper, resentment. Then he remembered Reverend Todd, and the minister's uneasy relationship with Alasdair. Years earlier, Todd had been implicated, indirectly, in a dispute over land near the kirk, with Malcolm Fraser acting as a mediator. The village had moved on, but the memory lingered in whispers, tension, jealousy, and the kind of pride that simmered quietly for years. Hamish realized that the minister and Mrs. Munro's late husband had been linked, and that Alasdair, ever vigilant, had not forgotten. Back at the vestry, Hamish traced the timeline in his mind, overlaying it with the old disputes. Ewan Mackenzie had been drawn into the conflicts, only peripherally slighted in the past, criticised by Alasdair for half-kept promises, but the core grudges stretched further, threading through family inherited NCE and old loyalties. The buttons, the careful cleaning, the locked door, all of it pointed to someone who had both knowledge of the night's routines and a long memory of Alasdair's habits, someone who understood that timing, silence, and social expectation could be manipulated. Hamish reviewed the scrap of paper again. I swear never. Its ambiguity now seemed deliberate. It referenced not just Alasdair's last New Year oath, but a promise buried in history, a secret known only to those who had crossed paths in the old disputes. He began to see a web forming, a hidden link between Mrs. Munro, Reverend Todd, and even Ewan in minor ways, tied together by unspoken debts, buried resentments, and the weight of village tradition. It became clear that this murder was not about one moment of rage or a petty jealousy. It was about history, long-standing grievances that had festered and mutated, waiting for the right opportunity. Alasdair's insistence on order, on accountability, had brought old tensions to the surface at the most dangerous moment, Hogmanay, when old promises were spoken aloud, and old wounds were remembered. Hamish realized the buttons, the footprints, even the apparent misdirections, were part of a choreography, performed by someone who knew both the physical layout of the vestry and the psychological map of the village. Someone was playing on the shared memory of past slights, weaving them into the present to confuse investigators, to shield themselves in plain sight. By evening, the detective was convinced of one thing. The key to solving the murder lay not in the immediate, visible actions of the villager, but in the shadows cast by their shared past. The murder was the latest link in a chain stretching back years, a chain that Alasdair, in his pursuit of oaths and moral authority, had unwittingly exposed. Hamish knew that to catch the killer, he would have to untangle that past, forcing long-buried secrets into the light, and he suspected that the person responsible was already watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. As he walked back through the snow-clogged streets of Lough, Hamish felt the weight of history pressing down, every house and hedge holding fragments of grudges, alliances, and betrayals. Somewhere in that frozen village, the murderer remained patient, confident in their knowledge of both human nature and the village's long memory. Hamish pressed his coat tighter, senses alert. The past had spoken. It was only a matter of time before it revealed the truth completely. Hamish returned to the kirk the following morning, carrying nothing but a notebook and his own patience. He didn't intend to confront anyone directly yet. Instead, he had a plan, a subtle test, one that didn't rely on interrogation or accusation, but on observation and human instinct. He set up the vestry as it had been, nearly identical to the scene, with the chair in the same place, the slight scuff visible, and the 2 buttons laid discreetly on air. Mole cloth at the back of the room. Nothing about it was flashy, nothing about it screamed trap, but Hamish knew that the mind's guilty conscience often betrays itself in the smallest ways. He called Ewan Mackenzie first, under the pretext of reviewing the case once more. "I need someone familiar with the room," Hamish said, keeping his tone casual. "Just help me recall where everything was the night of the murder. You'll recognize it, surely." Ewan nodded, uneasy, following Hamish inside. Hamish watched him closely, noting the way his eyes roamed, how his fingers twitched, the shallow, measured breathing. "Notice anything odd?" Hamish asked, voice light. Ewan shook his head. "No, everything looks like it did." Hamish nodded, pretending to check his notebook. "The scuff on the floor, it's faint, but someone could have brushed against it, yes?" Ewan's head jerked slightly, his eyes narrowing at the floor. Hamish didn't react. He simply let him stand there. "And these buttons," he added casually, gesturing toward the cloth. "I found one near the window. That's the smaller one, yes, but the larger. Never seen it before." Ewan froze, just for a heartbeat, but long enough. His mouth opened, closed, and his gaze flicked to Hamish, searching, uncertain. Then he laughed nervously, brushing it off. I don't know. Maybe someone dropped it last night." Hamish stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Ewan, the truth doesn't have to be loud. It's the little things that speak the loudest." E watched Ewan's fingers, how they flexed as though gripping something invisible. "You've noticed the larger button before. You recognized it the moment you saw it." Ewan's composure faltered. A flush rose across his cheeks. He glanced at the chair, then at the floor, then back at Hamish. His voice trembled. I was there, but I didn't do it the way they think. I only meant to scare him, to stop him from exposing what he knew. I never intended." Hamish held up a hand. "Easy. Just breathe. That's all I'm asking. Tell me what happened in your words." The confession wasn't complete. Ewan stumbled over the details, leaving holes and ambiguity, but it revealed something vital. He had been present in the vestry at the crucial moment. Not the murderer, but a participant in the sequence, someone entangled in a moment of fear and manipulation. The buttons, the scuff, the locked door, they hadn't been planted by him, but he had observed the actions of the true killer, and in doing so had carried guilt that nearly betrayed him. Hamish let Ewan sit down, offering a small nod. He knew the psychological test had worked because Ewan had revealed his knowledge without being directly accused. The tactic was simple. Recreate the scene, hint at anomalies, let conscience react. The guilty or the complicit always left traces, even in words, even in hesitation, even in the smallest physical tell, leaving Ewan to gather himself. Hamish walked to the window where the buttons had been found. Tracing the edge of the sill with his gloved fingers, the larger button was missing from the man it belonged to. Someone had been careless, confident, yet not flawless. Hamish knew that with this clue the psychological echo of guilt paired with the physical evidence he was closing in. The real killer had made mistakes small enough to escape casual notice, but the combination of careful observation and human instinct was beginning to illuminate them. By the time he left the Kirk, Hamish understood one thing clearly. The murderer was still hiding behind a veil of everyday civility, confident in the village's routines, but fragile under subtle scrutiny. And tonight, Hamish would test the other suspect in the same quiet, patient way, letting conscience do what words could not. The shadows in Lochdob were beginning to tremble. Hamish returned to the vestry the next morning, determined to consolidate the new insights he had gained from Ewan's hesitant confession. The snow outside had begun to thaw into slush, leaving muddy tracks where villagers walked, but inside, the room felt untouched, frozen in its quiet tension. He went first to the buttons, carefully arranged on the cloth as before. They were the tangible link between observation and suspicion, the first physical clue that could lead him closer to the real killer, and they were gone. Hamish froze, scanning the room in disbelief. The smaller button near the window, the larger one that had revealed Ewan's partial involvement, both vanished. The cloth lay empty, neatly folded, as if someone had removed them with care. Nothing else seemed disturbed. No footprints beyond the usual, no forced entry, no signs of struggle, only absence. His mind worked rapidly, tracing possibilities. The removal was deliberate. The thief had to know the significance of what they took, and they had to be confident enough to do it while the vestry might be watched. It was not a random act, it was interference, obstruction, and a warning. Someone was trying to bury the truth before Hamish could fully expose it. The first person he thought of was Reverend Todd. The minister had been meticulous, calm, observant, and careful about appearances. He had knowledge of the church's routines, access to the vestry at odd hours, and a reason to keep secrets hidden. Yet Hamish did not discount Mrs. Munro, whose family history intertwined with the old disputes, or even someone entirely unexpected, watching from the edges, confident that small pieces could be removed without anyone noticing. Hamish stepped outside, eyes sharp, scanning the surrounding walls and snow. No footprints indicated someone leaving hurriedly. Whoever had taken the buttons had left no trace, leaving Hamish to confront an unsettling reality. The criminal had both forethought and patience. They were operating in silence, manipulating evidence before it could implicate them, confident that the village's trust and routines would shield them. Back inside, Hamish traced the timeline. He recalled Ewan's nervous reactions, the subtle tells, the buttons, and the scuff by the chair. Each point of observation had been leading somewhere, but now the missing button left a gap, a space where someone could hide behind doubt and misdirection. The pressure intensified. He realized that without physical evidence, the case might stall indefinitely, leaving the village to accept the wrong conclusion and the real killer free to manipulate the story further. Hamish sat down heavily, rubbing his temples. He considered the scrap of paper again. I swear never. The meaning now seemed layered, not just referencing Alasdair's last oath, but the web of hidden resentments and secret knowledge that had allowed the killer to act with confidence. The removal of evidence was a message subtle but unmistakable. I am always one step ahead. By late afternoon he returned to the station, where Ewan was pacing, restless. Hamish kept his expression calm. "The buttons are gone," he said simply. Ewan froze mid-step. "Gone how?" "I don't know exactly," Hamish replied. "But someone knew what they meant. Someone wanted to prevent them from speaking." He watched Ewan carefully, noting the flicker in his eyes, the slight hesitation in his breathing. "That doesn't mean we're finished. It just means the person who did this thinks they can hide behind others. They can't." Even as he spoke, Hamish's mind raced, considering who had the access, the knowledge, and the patience to remove evidence without detection. It could not have been random. The real killer was aware that Hamish was closing in, reacting strategically and manipulating both the timeline and perception. The stakes had risen suddenly, sharply. Trust was fragile. Everyone, from villagers to officers, could now be hiding knowledge, whether intentionally or not. Hamish left the station, feeling the chill deeper now, both from the winter air and the sense of opposition closing in. The case was no longer just a puzzle to solve. It had become a contest of wits with an adversary who knew the village and its rhythms intimately. The murderer was still out there, moving invisibly, and each day without resolution strengthened their advantage. Hamish knew he could no longer rely solely on routine methods. The hunt had become a game, and every misstep could bury the truth permanently. Walking back through the narrow, slushy streets of Lochdub, Hamish's eyes flicked to every shadow, every doorway, every familiar face. The buttons were gone, but the story was not, and the real killer, watching from the periphery, would soon realize that Hamish Macbeth was not so easily deterred. Hamish had barely settled in his cottage that evening when a sharp, urgent knock rattled the door. He opened it to find Constable Stewart, eyes wide and breathless. "Hamish, it's the Fraser home. Mrs. Munro, she's missing, and there's blood." Hamish's stomach tightened. He grabbed his coat without a word, the chill outside doing little to quell the cold fear creeping up his spine. The snow had turned to ice in places, making each step treacherous as he ran toward the village's eastern edge. The Fraser home stood dark, shuttered against the winter night, the usual warmth of hearth and lamp extinguished. Constable Stewart was already at the door, hesitating. Inside, the air was sharp with the metallic tang of fresh blood. Hamish's eyes swept the room. Mrs. Munro's chair sat toppled. A scarf lay crumpled on the floor, and a faint trail of footprints led from the back door into the snow. Whoever had come had acted quickly, leaving only the barest signs of a struggle. Nothing had been taken except the person, gone. Stewart whispered, voice low. Hamish knelt by the scarf, noticing the faint smear of blood that had been wiped partially, not entirely. Whoever had taken her knew what they were doing, but they hadn't anticipated Hamish noticing the trail. He followed it outside, boots crunching over snow and ice, the prints curving around the back of the property, then disappearing into the shadow of the woods. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that pressed down on the chest. He returned to the house, studying the interior. A window slightly ajar had been used as a point of access. But the locks were undisturbed, the glass unbroken. The fingerprints would tell something, eventually, but Hamish already knew this was no random act. It was deliberate, strategic, and meant to send a message. The killer was escalating, showing that they could move not just with secrecy but with confidence, striking when least expected. Hamish's mind raced through suspects. The removal of the buttons, the subtle psychological tests, Ewan's partial involvement, everything pointed towards someone intimately familiar with the village's rhythms, someone patient and ruthless. And now, with Mrs. Munro taken, the stakes had risen beyond mere investigation. This was personal and immediate. Outside, Hamish noticed the snow near the back of the house had been slightly disturbed, not just footprints, but marks suggesting dragging, as though a body had been moved with care, yet with urgency. He crouched, examining the pattern. It was methodical, precise, and pointed to an individual who understood both human behaviour and the landscape of Lochtub. The killer was orchestrating events, forcing the village to react on their terms. Hamish returned to the streets, alert and moving quickly, following instincts honed over years. The village, previously hushed by snow, now seemed eerie, every shadow a possible hiding place. He realized that the game had changed. The killer was no longer content to remain unseen, no longer content to rely on misdirection alone. Each move was calculated to provoke fear, to destabilize, to keep the detective off balance. By nightfall, Hamish had pieced together the sequence of events as best he could. Mrs. Munro's disappearance was not random. She had known too much about the old disputes, about the grudges threading through the village history. Her absence was both a warning and a tool, a means to slow Hamish, while the real killer prepared the next move. Hamish pressed his hands to his face, feeling the weight of urgency settle over him. This was no longer a case that could be solved through careful observation alone. The killer was active, mobile, and several steps ahead. Hamish would need to anticipate, to predict, to draw them out before another life was at risk. The snow-covered village seemed calm in appearance, but Hamish felt the tension coiling in every darkened alley, in every shuttered window. Somewhere in the shadows, the murderer waited, confident, patient, and dangerous, and Hamish knew that unless he acted quickly, there would be no stopping what was coming next. He stepped into the night, eyes narrowing against the cold, resolve hardening. The chase was no longer about discovery, it was about prevention. And the killer's next move was already in motion. Hamish spent the next morning walking the village streets, retracing familiar paths, revisiting every house, and quietly questioning neighbours under the guise of casual conversation. The disappearance of Mrs. Munro had unsettled everyone, and even the bravest villagers moved carefully, watching shadows, as if they might conceal more than the night itself. Hamish's mind, however, was focused on details, the tiny fragments of behaviour and objects that others dismissed as trivial. He returned to the kirk, standing in the vestry for longer than usual, staring at the now empty space where the buttons had been. The scuff by the chair caught his eye again, and he crouched to examine it closely. Something about it had always seemed deliberate, a mark that was too cleanly made to be accidental, yet too subtle to provoke attention. As he ran his gloved hand over the stone, a thought struck him, a comment Mrs. Munro had made weeks ago, casual and almost forgotten, when she'd mentioned how Reverend Todd always insisted on placing his hat in exactly the same spot on the vestry's bench before service. She'd laughed lightly at his obsession with order, saying it was as if he believed a single, misplaced object could disrupt the entire village. Hamish had dismissed it then, but now it seemed to resonate. The meticulousness, the control, the insistence on precision. What if the killer's movements, the cleaned hands, the locked doors, the missing buttons, the orchestrated intimidation, all reflected an obsession with order, a pattern hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone attentive enough to notice? He remembered the small, unusual details, the missing buttons themselves, the precise wiping of the blood in the Fraser home, the clean paths through the snow outside. The way Ewan had hesitated over the larger button, the subtle misplacement of the chair. None of these were random. They were deliberate, markers of a mind that thrived on control and expected others to follow strict, almost ritualistic rules that could be manipulated to produce fear, uncertainty, and distraction. Hamish jotted notes quickly, connecting threads. Each incident, each small act of care, each alteration of the environment was part of a larger rhythm, a signature. The killer was sending messages, or perhaps testing responses, forcing everyone to react to the illusion of chaos, while keeping the real plan invisible. And once he saw it, once the rhythm revealed itself, he realized that the earlier false victory of pinning the case on Ewan had been engineered. The footprints, the overeager confessions, even Ewan's nervous admissions, all part of the choreography, meant to mislead anyone. Ho failed to notice the subtle markers. Hamish left the vestry and walked to the manse. The Reverend Todd, always so precise, had been the common link in nearly every interaction. The misplaced items, the obsession with ritual, the careful cleaning and control over the environment, it all aligned with the patterns Hamish had begun to see. He recalled the minister's hands, raw and red from excessive washing, the slightly forced explanations, the avoidance of certain questions. Each small act had seemed innocuous, even routine, until now, returning to the village square. Hamish paused near the fountain. He looked at the villagers moving past, the way they avoided eye contact, the subtle hesitations when mentioning Alasdair or Mrs. Munro. He realized that the key to the case had never been hidden in grand gestures, dramatic clues, or overt confessions. It had been right in front of him all along, woven into the rhythms of village life, the obsessive attention to order, and the tiny deviations that suggested someone was manipulating events deliberately. Hamish understood that the killer had been confident, patient, and cunning, but also predictable in their obsession with control. The pattern emerged as clearly as frost etching the windows of his cottage. Every action, every small anomaly was intentional, and by reading them correctly, the murderer could be anticipated. He pressed his hand to his chin, feeling the familiar thrill of clarity amid chaos. The threads were aligning, and at last the invisible outline of the killer was beginning to emerge. The next move, Hamish knew, would be crucial not just to solve the murders, but to prevent the next act of violence. The village held its breath, and Hamish Macbeth's eyes narrowed. The pattern was clear. The game was no longer abstract. The killer was within reach, and he would find them before they struck again. Hamish spent the evening quietly observing the village from the kirk tower, letting the faint glow of lanterns and hearth fires paint the streets below. The snow had hardened into ice in the cold night, reflecting every lamplight, every shadow, making the familiar streets appear foreign and distorted. His mind replayed the emerging pattern, the obsessive precision, the missing buttons, and the careful misdirection. Something still nagged at him, a question he hadn't yet asked aloud. Why Alasdair? Why the ritualistic killings and disappearances? Why the careful orchestration, if not for a personal vendetta? It hit him suddenly. The scrap of paper, I swear never, was not just about the New Year oath. It was about broken trust, broken promises, and the fear of exposure. The killer had not acted out of simple anger, jealousy, or fear of judgment. This was far more intimate. Hamish recalled Mrs. Munro's offhand comment about the old disputes, the minister's obsessive habits, Ewan's partial confessions, and the long-forgotten feud involving her late husband, Malcolm Fraser. It all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The killer was deeply tied to Alasdair's moral authority, obsessed not with personal gain, but with controlling the legacy of the oaths he had enforced, and punishing anyone who threatened to reveal what had been hidden for decades. Hamish returned to the Fraser home before dawn. He examined the rooms carefully, retracing the steps where Mrs. Munro had vanished, noting the subtle details, the toppled chair, the scarf, the faint traces of blood that had been partially wiped away. The meticulousness struck him again. Whoever had done this had a singular obsession with control of the physical environment, control of perceptions, control of consequences. This wasn't just a murder, it was a projection of the killer's inner compulsion, a way to impose order on a world they felt had been chaotic. As he pieced together the movements of the night, one figure began to dominate the picture, Reverend Todd. The minister's obsession with neatness, ritual, and control had always been apparent, but Hamish now saw it in a new light. Todd had believed himself responsible for maintaining the moral and social balance of the village, and Alasdair's uncompromising enforcement of the oaths threatened that delicate equilibrium. More than that, Todd's pride had been wounded years earlier, in the disputes involving Malcolm Fraser, and Alasdair's judgment had never let him forget it. Hamish's thoughts coalesced. The killings were not acts of passion, nor were they impulsive. They were the careful, deliberate execution of a plan to assert dominance, to silence threats, and to manipulate everyone around him. The removal of the buttons, the careful cleaning, the locked doors, the staging a Ewan as a scapegoat, all served to satisfy Todd's obsession with order while removing any challenge to his authority. The hidden motive was psychological, an intense need to control, to rewrite history according to his own terms, and to punish those who had ever threatened his sense of moral supremacy. Hamish finally understood the chilling truth. The villain's mind had been shaped by decades of suppressed resentment, reinforced by the rigid social hierarchies of Lockdub. Every action, every subtle misdirection, every staged misstep was an expression of that compulsive drive. The murders were a manifestation of a psyche that equated order with righteousness, punishment with preservation, and secrecy with power. Todd had been willing to kill to maintain the illusion that he was the arbiter of moral authority, and to ensure that the village, as he understood it, remained under his influence by the time dawn broke, Hamish had formulated his plan. He could no longer rely on waiting for mistakes or passive observations. The killer's psychology was now clear, and Hamish knew exactly what would provoke the next move. Todd's obsession would compel him to act, and in doing so, he would reveal himself fully. But the detective also understood the danger, misjudging Todd. His compulsions could cost another life, perhaps Ewan's, perhaps even Mrs. Munro's, standing in the first pale light of morning. Hamish pressed his hands together and let the cold bite at his fingers. The hidden motive was no longer hidden. It had been exposed in the obsessive patterns, the subtle misdirections, and the old, buried feuds. The case was no longer just about solving the murders. It was about anticipating the mind behind them, predicting the next action of a man who equated control with morality, and would go to any extreme to preserve it. Hamish felt the familiar thrill of certainty, tempered by the weight of urgency. The villain was revealed, and the final confrontation was inevitable. Hamish spent the rest of the morning quietly preparing. He didn't announce his intentions, and he didn't need to. The pattern he had uncovered dictated the next move. The village, still draped in frost, remained oblivious, its narrow streets and shuttered windows hiding more than the occasional whisper. He needed to draw Todd out, to exploit the obsession he now understood so well, the need for control, for order, for perfection in the execution of his plans. Hamish returned to the vestry, leaving the room arranged precisely as it had been the night of Alasdair's murder. The chair was slightly askew, the scuff visible, and the cloth, where the buttons had been subtly positioned to catch attention without drawing suspicion. He left the door slightly open, just enough to suggest neglect, and withdrew to a shadowed corner. He knew Todd would come unable to resist correcting, adjusting, and examining the scene. It was only a matter of time. Evening came, and with it the faint echo of footsteps. Todd's figure appeared in the doorway, careful, deliberate, eyes scanning every detail. He paused, taking in the room, then began moving as Hamish expected, inspecting the scuff, reaching for the cloth, brushing his fingers along the edges of the window-sill. Every action was deliberate, meticulous, almost ritualistic. Hamish watched quietly, heart steady, breathing even. "You always did like things tidy," Reverend Hamish said from the shadows. Todd stiffened, eyes darting toward him. And yet, someone left such a mess here. How careless. Todd's hand froze over the cloth, then withdrew. His face was pale, lips pressed tight. It's nothing. Just routine. Just. Hamish stepped forward, calm, deliberate. Routine? Or habit? Perhaps a compulsion you can't resist. You like things in order, correct? You can't ignore disorder? Todd's eyes flickered, a flash of anger and fear. I do not know what you mean." "You do," Hamish said, voice gentle but unyielding. "I've seen the pattern, the scuff, the buttons, the careful cleaning, the locked doors. You orchestrated every step, manipulating the village and framing others because you believe it's your right to control outcomes, to punish those who threaten what you consider order. It's not about money. It's not revenge. It's the obsession that drove you to Alasdair, to Mrs. Munro, to you. Everything was to preserve your sense of control." Todd's hands trembled, his composure cracking. You don't understand. They would have ruined everything. Alasdair, he would have." "You're afraid of exposure," Hamish said, stepping closer, eyes locked. "Of losing control. That's why you've acted, why you've removed evidence, why you've staged Ewan. But you can't hide behind order anymore. The pattern gave you away." The Reverend's shoulders slumped, his head lowering in defeat. He muttered something under his breath, words tangled in fear and obsession. Hamish allowed him a moment, letting the weight of his own psychological traps settle over Todd. The careful, controlled killer, used to manipulating everyone else, was now cornered by the one person who had predicted every compulsive move. Suddenly, Todd lunged, not with a weapon, but desperate, hands flailing toward the window, perhaps to escape. Hamish was ready. A quick sidestep and a firm grip on the minister's arm halted him, holding him steady without force. "It's over, Reverend," Hamish said calmly, maintaining control. "No one else needs to be harmed." Todd sank into a chair, panting, the fight draining from him. I only wanted to keep the village safe, to maintain order." Hamish shook his head. "Order isn't maintained through murder. You allowed obsession to dictate action, and now you must answer for it." He gestured toward the door, where Constable Stewart had quietly entered, ready to secure Todd. "You'll explain everything, the murders, the manipulations, the disappearances, Every last detail. It ends tonight. Todd's face twisted with a mix of relief, shame, and lingering defiance. Hamish watched him, composed, unshaken, knowing that every piece of the puzzle, every button, scuff, footprint, hesitation had led to this moment. The trap had worked because it was designed around the killer's own compulsions, exploiting the pattern, the psychology, and the need for control. As Stuart guided the Reverend away, Hamish allowed himself a slow exhale. The village would soon begin to heal, though the echoes of Alasdair's oaths and Todd's obsessions would linger. Hamish stepped outside into the crisp night air, looking over the frozen streets of Lochdob. Justice had been achieved, not by force alone, but by patience, observation, and an understanding of the mind behind the chaos. The killer's reign of manipulation was over, and the village, fragile but resilient, could finally begin to breathe again. Hamish had barely returned to his cottage when a sharp, uneasy thought struck him. The night felt unnaturally still, almost as if the village itself were holding its breath. Todd was secured. The buttons returned to evidence, and the villagers had begun murmuring about closure, but Hamish knew better than to trust appearances. Something still hummed beneath the surface, an imperceptible tension he couldn't ignore. Reviewed the sequence in his mind: Alasdair's murder, Mrs. Munro's disappearance, Ewan's nervous involvement, Todd's obsessive manipulation. Everything pointed to a single pattern, a compulsive need for control, but one detail had always seemed slightly out of place. Second button, the larger one that had triggered Ewan's confession, and yet had been removed before the case fully unfolded. Hamish had assumed Todd had taken it during the vestry scene, but why leave so many other traces behind? The choice of evidence to remove was deliberate, but selective, almost purposeful in a way that suggested outside oversight. Hamish returned to the police station to review the evidence one more time. Constable Stewart had been sorting statements when Hamish's eyes fell on something small, almost invisible, a letter that had been slipped into Ewan's coat pocket during the frenzy of the investigation. It was unassuming, folded neatly, bearing the initials M.F. Hamish. Carefully unfolded it, scanning the cramped, precise handwriting. The letter referenced Alasdair, Todd, and the events leading to the New Year oaths, but concluded with a chilling sentence: everything depends on keeping them unaware. One wrong move, and the plan collapses. A cold shiver ran down Hamish's spine. Malcolm Fraser, Mrs. Munro's late husband, he had been dead for years, but Hamish remembered the old feud, the subtle threats whispered in confidence, and the lingering family tensions. Could someone else, in the air, Razor family have been orchestrating events from the shadows, using Todd's compulsions as a weapon? He glanced at Ewan, who sat nervously nearby, fidgeting with his coat buttons. Hamish followed the thread, piecing together what he had overlooked. The murders, the removal of evidence, the calculated misdirections all pointed not to a single person acting alone, but to a network, a carefully nurtured plan spanning decades of grudges and obsession. Todd had been the hand executing the plan, but the mind behind it, someone who understood the village's history intimately, had remained hidden, feeding him just enough information to manipulate events without revealing themselves. A thought struck Hamish like a hammer. Mrs. Munro. Her absence had initially been a tool of fear, a distraction, but now he realized she had survived, carefully hiding, observing, and perhaps communicating indirectly. And the letters, the subtle manipulations, they bore the hallmark of someone who had lived through the original disputes, someone who had learned to play the villagers like pieces on a board. The true mastermind wasn't Todd at all. He had been a pawn, albeit a deadly one. Hamish's mind raced. If the orchestrator had been so careful, so patient, they were likely still in the village, watching, waiting to see how events unfolded. Every assumption he had made about Todd's motives, Ewan's involvement, even the removal of the buttons, was now part of a larger design. The puzzle was not finished. The F.R. hidden piece had just shifted into view. He needed proof, and quickly. Hamish retraced the steps of the last few days, focusing on subtle anomalies, someone who had been unusually attentive to the investigation, a neighbour whose statements had seemed too measured, too cautious, almost rehearsed. And then it clicked: the bookseller, quiet and polite, had asked unusually detailed questions about the vestry and Todd's movements. He had never drawn suspicion, but now the pattern aligned: access, knowledge, patience, and a long memory of old grievances. Hamish felt the familiar thrill of revelation mixed with a new tension. The case was no longer closed. The detective who had thought himself steps ahead was now forced to confront a hidden adversary, one who had orchestrated chaos through others while remaining invisible. He understood that catching this true mastermind would require more than observation. It would require ingenuity, courage, and the ability to predict the next move of someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting deception. The snow fell lightly outside, muffling the village in a blanket of quiet, but Hamish's mind raced alert, alive. The first layer of the crime was resolved, but the real game, the one that had begun decades ago in secret, was only just beginning. And Hamish Macbeth, patient, perceptive, and relentless, knew he was the only one capable of exposing it. The final confrontation, the true test of his genius, lay ahead, and the stakes had never been higher. Hamish spent the next day moving quietly through the village, retracing the subtle signs he had noted, watching the villagers' reactions to Todd's arrest, and considering the letter that had surfaced. Every glance, every gesture, every offhand comment now had new meaning. The village seemed calmer on the surface, but Hamish felt the tension simmering beneath the snow. Someone else was still at work, someone who had orchestrated events with patience and cunning. He returned to the vestry one last time, observing the room in the dim afternoon light. The scuff by the chair, the edge of the window sill, the cloth where the button had briefly lain, all the small, overlooked details suddenly made sense. Todd had been the executor, the visible force, but the mastermind had relied on the patterns and habits of the village itself to manipulate him. The misplaced buttons, the meticulously wiped traces, even the carefully staged psychological tests, all of it had been designed to keep suspicion focused elsewhere. Hamish called Yuan aside, speaking in a low, calm voice. "Do you remember the moment you hesitated over the larger button?" Yuan nodded, uneasy. "That hesitation wasn't just guilt," Hamish continued. "It was planted. Someone expected you to notice it, to react in just the way you did. That reaction made the others see a solution too soon, but it also revealed the truth to those who knew how to read it, me, and the one who orchestrated everything from behind the scenes." Yuan frowned, confusion and fear mingling in his eyes. "So, Todd wasn't acting alone?" "No," Hamish said. "Todd was the instrument, but someone else guided the hand. The subtle misdirections, the removal of the buttons, the careful staging of evidence, it all points to someone with long memory and intimate knowledge of the village, someone who could manipulate the past to control the present. Watch carefully, and the pattern is unmistakable." As Hamish spoke, a shadow passed the vestry window. He turned, instinct sharp. A figure lingered near the edge of the lane, a quiet, watchful presence that immediately caught his attention. The bookseller, he realized, the same man who had asked pointed questions about Todd's movements and the vestry arrangements. The realization came in a rush. This was the true mastermind, the hidden orchestrator who had used Todd's compulsions as a shield while directing the chain of events. Hamish moved carefully, keeping his distance, and followed the figure as they moved through the village, slipping between alleys and hedgerows with the practiced ease of someone who knew every hidden path. But just as he approached, the figure disappeared into the fog, rolling in from the loch, vanishing almost impossibly into the night. Hamish stopped, breath visible in the cold air, frustration mixing with admiration. The mastermind had been revealed, but not caught. Returning to the village centre, Hamish gathered the key pieces of the case in his mind. The scuff, the buttons, the psychological reactions, and the letter all had been deliberate clues, subtle and clever, designed to manipulate perception while leaving just enough evidence for someone attentive to see the truth. He explained it to Constable Stewart, carefully tracing each step. Todd acted out of obsession and compulsion, he said, but the true villain manipulated him, using patterns that only someone who knew the village and its history intimately could predict. The buttons weren't just evidence, they were a message, meant to provoke reactions and guide suspicion away from the orchestrator. Stewart shook his head, bewildered. "So we caught Todd, but the real mind behind it?" Hamish's eyes swept over the quiet village, the shadows stretching long in the setting sun. "Gone for now," he said, "but they revealed themselves, just briefly. The puzzle isn't entirely solved, but the dangerous piece, the one capable of immediate harm, is accounted for. Todd will answer for his actions. The mastermind may have escaped tonight, but they left clues that we will follow. The pattern has been exposed, the psychology understood, and the truth remains in our hands." As Hamish walked home through the icy streets, the wine biting at his cheeks, he allowed himself a measured breath. Justice had been partially served, yet the lingering presence of the true orchestrator left an unsettling tension in the air, a reminder that in Lochdub, even when crimes appear resolved, shadows of the past and the cunning of the present can never be fully controlled. And Hamish Macbeth, as always, would remain one step ahead, eyes sharp, mind alert, ready for the next twist in the silent game the village had long been unwittingly playing. Hamish walked slowly through the village as twilight deepened, the cold air biting at his cheeks and carrying the faint scent of smoke from hearths long extinguished. The streets were quiet, the snow hardened into ice, and yet the village felt alive in a subtle, uneasy way, as if it knew that some truths had been revealed while others lingered just beyond reach. Todd was in custody, the visible threat contained, and the villagers whispered cautiously about closure. Still, Hamish's mind was restless, circling over the threads he had traced, the hidden patterns he had uncovered, and the elusive mastermind who had slipped away into the fog. He passed the kirk one last time, glancing at the scuff by the chair, still visible in the dim light, the faint reminder of Alasdair's final night, and the careful choreography that had unfolded afterward. The buttons had been returned to evidence, but the larger picture, the orchestration, the manipulations, the hidden hand guiding Todd remained incomplete. Hamish considered the letter with the initials MF and its cryptic warning. Whoever had written it had carefully anticipated reactions, controlled events from a distance, and allowed just enough misdirection to create confusion. The mind behind it was brilliant, patient, and still free. As he continued down the narrow lanes toward his cottage, Hamish's eyes caught a small detail he hadn't noticed before, a scrap of paper lodged in the gutter near the fountain, half buried under ice. He bent to retrieve it, brushing off the frost, and saw the familiar, precise handwriting of the orchestrator. Only a few words were legible. They see too much. Next step. And then a scribble that might have been a symbol or a set of initials. Hamish's pulse quickened. The message was vague, but deliberate, a taunt, and a warning that the game was not finished. He pocketed the scrap, considering what it meant. The village might feel safer tonight, but the true mind behind the chaos was still moving, still thinking, and still watching. The pattern, the psychological manipulations, the obsession with control, none of it had ended with Todd's capture. The orchestrator had left a final breadcrumb, a subtle hint that more could come, that the lessons of past oaths and old grudges had not been fully learned. Reaching the edge of the loch, Hamish paused and looked out across the dark, rippling water, the low fog drifting along the surface. He thought of Alasdair, Mrs. Munro, Ewan, and Todd, the series of events that had ensnared them all, and the intrigue, a web spun by someone clever enough to remain unseen. Justice had been served for the crimes committed, but justice alone could not erase the cleverness and patience of a mind capable of orchestrating such a complex chain of events. Hamish's breath clouded in the cold air as he straightened, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The village was safe for now, but he knew better than anyone that safety was fleeting, especially when someone so patient, so meticulous, and so ruthless was still out there. Every detail mattered: the mislaid objects, the seemingly trivial habits, the cryptic letters, all potential hints to the next mystery, the next trap, or the next crime waiting to unfold. He turned back toward the village, boots crunching over the ice, the glow from the cottages warming the darkened streets. In his mind he replayed every subtle gesture, every hesitation, every overlooked clue. The story of Alasdair's death, Todd's obsession, and the hidden mastermind had been told, but the lingering question remained: who would make the next move, and when? The game of observation, deduction, and patience would continue, and Hamish Macbeth, ever vigilant, would be ready. As he reached his door and stepped inside, he allowed himself a small, wry smile. The case had ended for now, but the faint whisper of unfinished business, the cryptic message, the shadow moving just out of reach, ensured that Loch Dubh would never truly be quiet. A mystery never NDS, Hamish thought, settling by the fire, and he would be there when the next one began.